20 years. That's how long it took me to understand things that, in hindsight, were obvious. 20 years of chasing the wrong goals, worrying about the wrong opinions, proving things that didn't need proving. And the strange part, no one tells you you're learning the hard way while you're in it. You make decisions. You double down on pride. You ignore small warnings until one day you look back and realise you could have saved yourself a lot of stress, a lot of ego, a lot of wasted energy. This video isn't advice from someone who has it all figured out, by the way. It's perspective from someone who finally slowed down long enough to see clearly. And if I had understood this earlier, life would have felt a lot lighter for me. You know, what's strange about time, when you're young, 20 years sounds like a lifetime. When you're older, it feels like a blink. And somewhere in those 20 years, working, trying, failing, building, losing, learning, I realised something. I realised a lot of things, but none of them came when I expected them to. They didn't come when I was chasing success, or trying to impress people, or proving myself. They came quietly, usually after I'd made mistakes, or lost something, or finally stopped pretending I had it all figured out. It took me 20 years to realise that most of what I worried about never mattered. I worried about what people thought about me. I worried about whether I looked successful enough, whether I was behind, whether I was doing life right. And here's what I eventually understood. Most people are too busy worrying about themselves to analyse you. The freedom that comes when you realise that is very hard to describe. You stop performing. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to be impressive. You just focus on being solid. It took me 20 years to realise that confidence isn't loud, it's quiet. When I was younger, I thought confident people were the ones who spoke the most, the ones who seemed certain about everything. Now I know that real confidence is the ability to say, I don't know, to walk away from something that isn't right, to sit in silence without needing to fill it. It took me 20 years to realise that discipline matters more than motivation. I spent years waiting to feel ready, waiting for energy, waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment doesn't arrive. The men who move forward aren't always motivated, they're just consistent. They do the boring thing again and again and again. And eventually that compounds. It took me 20 years to realise that money solves stress, but it doesn't solve meaning. I chased income at one point thinking it would fix everything. And yes, financial stability matters. It removes pressure. It gives options. But it doesn't automatically make you fulfilled. Meaning comes from contribution, from growth, from relationships, which leads me to something else. It took me 20 years to realise that relationships are fragile and they require intention. Friendships don't survive on history alone. You can't rely on we've known each other forever. People drift, not because they're bad, but because life pulls in so many different directions. If someone matters to you, you have to show it. You have to reach out. You have to make the effort. And if you don't, One day you look around and realise you're more isolated than you meant to be. It took me 20 years to realise that health is absolutely everything. 3 years ago, holding my mum's hand as she died of cancer, taking her final breaths, I realised health is everything. When you're younger, you trade sleep for ambition. You ignore stress. You assume your body will just cope until it doesn't. Energy is currency. If you don't protect it, you'll spend years feeling flat without knowing why. Sleep, movement, diet, sunlight, they sound basic, but they change absolutely everything. It took me 20 years to realise that you don't need as much approval as you think you do. For a long time I made decisions based on how they would look. Would this impress people? Would this make me seem successful? Will this make them proud? But when you live that way, you slowly disconnect from yourself. Peace comes when your decisions make sense to you, even if they confuse other people. It took me 20 years to realise that most fear is exaggerated. The conversation you're avoiding, usually not as bad as you imagine. The risk you're scared to take, often survivable. Rejection, temporary. Regret, much heavier. I've regretted hesitation far more than I've regretted action. It took me 20 years to realise that time is not patient. You assume there will be more of it. More time to call your parents, more time to fix relationships, more time to start the thing you've been thinking about. And then one day, you realise some windows have closed. That one hits harder than most lessons. It took me 20 years to realise that being strong doesn't mean silent. There were times I carried things alone because I thought that's what men were supposed to do. Handle it, don't complain, push through. But isolation isn't strength. Strength is knowing when to speak, who to trust, when to ask for support. It took me 20 years to realise that comparison is endless. There will always be someone ahead, more successful, fitter, richer, more confident. If you tie your worth to comparison, you never arrive. The only useful comparison is with who you were last year. That's it. It took me 20 years to realise that progress is slow and then sudden. For years, it feels like nothing is happening. You're trying, learning, failing quietly. And then one day, you look back and realise you're not the same person anymore. Growth is invisible while it's happening. That's why so many people quit too early. It took me 20 years to realise that peace is better than ego. Winning arguments doesn't feel as good as keeping relationships healthy. Being right doesn't matter as much as being calm. Protecting your energy is more important than proving your point, and maybe the biggest one. It took me 20 years to realise that life isn't something you figure out once. It's something you keep adjusting to. There is no final version of you, no permanent arrival point. You evolve, you adapt, you refine, and that's not failure, That's being alive. If you're younger and watching this, I don't expect you to absorb it all. I certainly wouldn't have. Some lessons can only be earned. But if you're somewhere in the middle, not young, not old, maybe this resonates. Maybe you're starting to see that the things you once obsessed over don't hold the same weight anymore. Maybe you're realizing that being steady beats being impressive. Maybe you're learning that peace is something you build, not something you stumble into. 20 years sounds like a long time, but the truth is, most of what matters is simple. Protect your health. Choose your people carefully. Act more than you hesitate. Value time. And don't build your life around someone else's expectations. It took me 20 years to realise that, and I'm still learning.